Hey everyone, it's me, Jacob, again at Feel Good Inc. And I'm back at it again with another podcast video talking about post-traumatic growth and what you can do to get your life back on track. So, the purpose of this podcast is to help guide individuals towards achieving post-traumatic growth and to try to help everyone else who might also be stuck in their journeys get unstuck. So here at Feel Good Inc., we want to put your life back into your reins and remind you that you can make the difference that you want in your life. So this is episode 23, and to start off, I kind of wanted to refresh you guys on my definition of post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth is the transformation or positive psychological change that occurs after experiencing any traumatic event. And that could range from a death in the family, a loss in a job, a loss of purpose. It could really be anything. And undergoing post-traumatic growth allows people to develop new identities or motivations. It could help you improve your relationships, find new possibilities. An example of this would just be like, could be finding hobbies, improving your self-esteem, and just getting closer to people that you hold dear in life. And the five domains of post-traumatic growth, according to Tedeschi and Calhoun, are personal strength, which is just becoming stronger and being ready for whatever comes next. Improve relationships. So improving the relationships you have with people that you have around you and kind of realizing the roles that you play in each other's lives. Um, Achieving a greater appreciation of life. And it's just finding gratitude in the little things. Um, The fourth domain is new possibilities, and that's finding new paths or opportunities in life. And number five is spiritual slash existential change. And this is just the changes in your beliefs in life about purpose. And it doesn't have to be religion, it can just be any type of belief that you have. So, for today's post-traumatic growth framework, I wanted to talk about Danielle King's a stigma conscious framework for resilience and post traumatic change. And this view of post traumatic growth kind of differs from what Tedeschi and Calhoun studied because it states that members of stigmatized groups like people of color or just any kind of marginalized people face different adverse events that not everyone else is able to undergo. And Tedeschi and Calhoun's post-traumatic growth framework kind of puts all those experiences under one umbrella, so it kind of generalizes everything. Despite the fact that post-traumatic growth is actually like really dependent on the resources that you have, as highlighted by Daniel King. Um, though their studies have provided a framework for understanding post-traumatic growth, they didn't really include stigmatization in any of their studies, and they didn't use the concepts of race or ethnicity or sexual orientation, and that kind of just generalizes people and their experiences, no matter how different they would be if these factors were considered. And the stigma conscious framework uses IMOI as its model for post-traumatic growth, and it looks to examine the multi-layered factors that being stigmatized has on people trying to undergo PTG. And this model explains that experiencing trauma is different for everybody, and especially if they belong to those stigmatized groups. And that stigma also affects how much adversity they face, the resources they have access to, and how plausible it might be for them to undergo PTG. And what IMOI stands for is inputs, mechanisms, outputs, and inputs. So it's like a feedback loop. So inputs is the challenges or disadvantages that people face, and it consists of structural, interpersonal, and individual factors. So structural factors are the adversity that an individual would face due to their environment. And stigmatized groups commonly suffer from discrimination in housing markets, higher job loss, and live in areas where there are higher rates of crime. There's some examples. Interpersonal factors are the adversities a person would face from personal interactions, and that might be like stereotyping, hate crimes, or any other microaggressions due to belonging in that stigmatized group. And individual factors are the internal experiences of someone who belongs to a stigmatized group. And that kind of affects how someone interprets traumatic events and how they cope with them. Mechanisms. So this is the available resources that can help shape the resilience of someone from a stigmatized group. Structural mechanisms are the resources they have that are controlled by systemic discrimination. So an example of this would be like access to education or financial stability. Um, Interpersonal mechanisms are the resources that come from an individual's social connections. And they're also the internal strengths and abilities that an individual can use to face adversity. So outputs are the outcome of an adverse event. So this is when someone has the appropriate resources for growth, or sorry, this is when someone has the appropriate resources for growth, growth can happen. But for stigmatized groups who don't have those same resources, change might not be positive. It might not be growth. Um, Resilience in an individual is the combined factors of life satisfaction and health. Even though stigmatized groups can show resilience on the surface, they undergo negative effects as a result of stress. And post-traumatic change highlights the fact that PTG doesn't completely apply to people who belong in stigmatized groups because of discrimination. And it's also important to note that there are two domains of PTG. New opportunities and improve relationships. These are much less likely for individuals who are stigmatized to undergo because of systemic discrimination. New opportunities are not as available to stigmatized groups, and improved relationships are less likely because stigma undermines social connection. So overall, um, the stigma conscious framework for resilience and post-traumatic change is it's pretty multifaceted and it accounts for a lot more variables than the PTG framework. And being able to look at things like the social economic factors of a person and applying them to how an individual would process traumatic events is, I would say, a deeper dive into their psyche. And overall, I think that this study shows that PTG and PTC are highly dependent on your resources. So personally, I am ethnically Filipino, and I grew up in an American environment. I've lived here for my whole life, so my framework is pretty reflective of some American experiences. Um, an adverse event that I underwent was my dad being hospitalized overnight due to a heart attack, and I was left home alone and didn't know what was going on until the morning after when I had called my mom where they were at, and she just briefly told me, and I pretty much freaked out. I was full of worry, paced back and forth in my house, and it was really traumatic because I wasn't sure what the future would hold, um, if my dad were to pass away. But luckily, I had a lot of access to social support and a school environment that allowed me to process what was going on. And I was able to talk to friends and relatives and tell them how I was feeling. At school, I met with my counselor often for their expert opinions on my next steps. And as a result, I became closer to my parents and friends who were able to help me. And that did reflect the improved relationships domain of post-traumatic growth. And additionally, afterwards, I began to cherish every moment that I spent with my dad. And that kind of showed the appreciation of life domain of post-traumatic growth. However, when referring to the stigma conscious framework of post-traumatic change, it kind of shows that I had the resources that I needed to undergo growth. And comparatively, this study is supposed to account for the fact that not everyone has these resources to go back to when they undergo an adverse event. So imagine where I would be had I not had my friends or the school's resources that I had during that time. Um, And a study that I found that observed the impact of self-efficacy and self-resilience in English English as a foreign language um, found that those that had high self-efficacy and self-resilience had a higher confidence in learning, despite the challenges that came from being EFL. And they also viewed obstacles as challenges instead of threats, allowing them to learn better. And I think that this parallels the idea that having high self-efficacy and self-resilience allows people to grow in the aftermath of adversity. And I chose these photos because they were the people that I had when this had all happened. So I have a photo of me and my friends at graduation and also my grandparents. And yeah. And finally, Danielle King's stigma conscious model for post-traumatic change is, I would say, indicative of the reliance on your environment and the social support system in achieving post-traumatic growth. And it also takes into account the multi-layered lives of people who belong in these stigmatized groups. And it also analyzes the way you process change after a traumatic event. And that's something that Tedeschi and Calhoun's model just kind of brushes over. Um, being or having high self-efficacy and which is the ability to believe in yourself that you can complete difficult tasks, and self-resilience, which is the ability to withstand adverse events and bounce back, will allow you to pretty much overcome everything. And possibly that'll lead you to achieving post-traumatic growth. And following Danielle King's stigma conscious framework for post-traumatic change will also allow you to take a step back and look at what's available to you and why PTG might be more difficult or why it might be easier for you. And it also help you realize that you are a product of your environment, and that with self-efficacy and self-resilience, you can be the change that you want in your life. And yeah. And the image that I have on the bottom right is a Pokemon, Charmander, and he evolves into like a super big dragon Charizard. And that's kind of reflective of post-traumatic growth. And finally, these are my sources, and that's it.